Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to the inaugural session of this term's Leuven seminar in classical German philosophy. So I'd like to welcome all of you, welcome many of you back, and at the same time invite you to our next sessions for the term. I will put the link to the program in the chat. Okay, so the link to the program is in the chat. So for today's session, we're very happy to welcome Stephen Houlgate and Bernardo Ferro. So Stephen Houlgate is professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick. He's published widely on all aspects of Hegel's philosophy, but he's also interested in Spinoza, Kant, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Derrida. So I'll just mention two of his monographs that are relevant to today's talk. There's the Introduction to Hegel, Freedom, Truth, and History, published in 2005. And there's volumes 1 and 2 of Hegel on Being, published recently in 2021. So his talk today will be Civil Society and its Discontents, Hegel and the Problem of Poverty. So Stephen Houlgate will talk for about 40 minutes. After that, we will have a response from Bernardo Ferro, about 8 to 10 minutes. We will give Stephen Houlgate a chance to respond to the response, and then we will move to the Q&A. If I could ask everybody just to turn on your cameras, if at all possible, just so we can all see each other and recreate a real seminar environment. During the Q&A, if you have questions, use the raise hand function or the chat if that is not working, or send me a message somehow and I will call on you in the order that you that I see your hand raised. After the session, we will have we will leave the room open, the link open, and have an informal chat for those of you that want to stay without the recording. Okay, so first we'll have Stephen Houlgate's contribution, and then we'll hear from Bernardo Ferro. So Bernardo Ferro, sorry, I'll introduce Bernardo now. So he's postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Philosophical Studies of the University of Coimbra. He focuses mainly on the history of modern European philosophy, social and political philosophy, and critical theory. So two of his recent publications are the monograph Masters, Slaves, and Philosophers, Plato, Hegel, and Nietzsche on Freedom and the Pursuit of Knowledge, published in 2022 with Springer, and the article that is forthcoming in the European Journal of Philosophy, although I think it's published in the online section already, if that's right, and that's entitled From Rechtsphilosophie to Staatsökonomie, Hegel and the Philosophical Foundations of Political Economy. Okay, so I very much look forward to the discussion today, and I hand the floor over to Stephen Houlgate.
Good, thank you very much, Pavel. Thank you, Karen, for the invitation, and thank you all for joining the talk, and of course to Bernardo in advance for his comments. So without further ado, I'll get into the paper. This is something that I've been interested in for many, many years, and I was given the opportunity to write this paper a couple of years ago for a conference on Terry Pinkett's work. So some of you may have heard it at that point. Many commentators argue that Hegel offered no solution to the problem of poverty in civil society. Here I defend an alternative view, namely that Hegel sees an answer in the corporations. I first defended this position in 1991, but it is fair to say that it has remained since then a minority view. For some readers of Hegel, his philosophy of right, PR, simply reflects the historical circumstances of his time. His aim on this view is to reconcile people to the modern social world as it is, here and now. My understanding of Hegel's project is somewhat different. His PR is not just an account of freedom in the modern state, an account that would look different if the state were to change in the future. The PR is governed by reason, or the concept, and sets out the logic of freedom, what freedom logically must be. Hegel certainly draws on examples from modern states, including Britain, to flesh out the forms of freedom and right he examines. But the latter are made necessary by the logic of freedom, not the prevailing circumstances. Hegel is unequivocal on this point. Now, I hope you have access to the handout. This is number 1 on the handout. The handout just contains various quotations. In philosophical cognition, the chief concern is the necessity of a concept, and the route by which it has become a result is its proof and deduction. Thus, given that its content is necessary for itself, the second step is to look around for what corresponds to it in our representations and language. But the representation is so far from being the measure and criterion of the concept, which is necessary and true for itself, that it must rather derive its truth from the concept and recognize and correct itself, sich berichtigen, with the help of the latter. This is paragraph 2 remark from the Philosophy of Right. Hegel's account of freedom is thus not just descriptive or reconstructive, but normative. It tells us what freedom must be. This does not mean, however, that it merely presents what freedom ought to be. As Hegel puts it, philosophy, quote, must distance itself as far as possible from the obligation to construct a state as it ought to be. Yet how can Hegel's account of the state be normative and not prescribe what freedom and the state ought to be? The familiar distinction between the is and the ought is found in the work of many philosophers. Hegel, however, draws a threefold distinction between what there simply is, or existence, what ought to be, and what something is in truth, what he also calls the concept or the idea of a thing. The latter differs from mere existence because it is what something is according to reason, what logically it must be if it is to be that thing, whether or not it actually exists. In this sense, the concept of freedom is normative. It determines what true freedom must be, whether or not it is found in the world. Yet precisely because this concept is grounded in reason, it determines not just what freedom ought to be according to opinion, meinen, but what freedom is in truth when it is understood properly. Hegel also insists, however, that reason is not so powerless that it only remains an ideal. Reason actualizes itself in the world and indeed constitutes actuality itself. Hence, Hegel's notorious Doppelsatz. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. Accordingly, in his philosophy of history, Hegel shows how true freedom has become actual, an historical reality in modern constitutional states. He shows, however, that modern states such as Britain and France embody freedom only more or less, and that none is the perfect embodiment of the state represented in the PR. This is because no state, however rational, is a pure artwork. So now we're in number 2 on the handout. The state exists in the world, and so exists in the sphere of arbitrariness, contingency, and error, Hegel says. Reason for Hegel does not, therefore, govern all aspects of modern states, but is the rose in the cross of the present, a cross that is all too real. Insofar as modern states realize the true idea of freedom and incorporate the forms of right set out in the PR, philosophy justifies their basic structures. Otherwise, however, the PR provides a rational standard by which to criticize states or institutions. It thus becomes a critical theory of freedom based on reason. This is true especially of Hegel's idea of the corporation. Corporations were abolished in France in 1791 and withered away in Britain. Yet Hegel understands them to be logically necessary components of a free, rational state. He thus advocates maintaining and restoring them against the apparent current of history. And his normative theory of the corporation thereby becomes a critique of present circumstances. This is evident, for example, in Hegel's 1824-25 lectures, in which he maintains, number 3, that the task of the time is to form corporations. But people do not want to resolve to do so. The need is present, but people fear thereby acting against principles that hold abstractly. Since corporations are made necessary by the logic of freedom, they cannot be rejected on the grounds that they are historically outdated, a strategy adopted by both liberal and Marxist critiques of Hegel's PR. Corporations are essential for true freedom, Hegel thinks. So if they are absent in modern states, that is a reason for criticizing those states, not for discarding the idea of the corporation. For Hegel, the concept of true freedom, as articulated in the PR, remains authoritative for all states and individuals that lay claim to being free. Thus, if a modern constitutional state claims to be free, but lacks corporations, the idea of true freedom requires that it develop them. This is true for all such states in the post-Hegelian world. The task of the time for these states is, to quote Hegel, to form corporations. Hegel begins his examination of civil society with the system of needs. The key to understanding this system is the difference between human beings and non-human animals. The animal, Hegel writes, has a limited circle of ways of satisfying its likewise limited needs. Human beings, by contrast, transcend such natural limitations by developing many different needs and dividing them into, I quote, individual aspects which then become different needs themselves. Humans want not just to keep warm, but to wear clothes of this fabric or this color. In the process, they also have to multiply and divide the means of satisfying their diverse needs. Their needs and the means of satisfying them thus become more refined. What drives the diversification of needs and the means of satisfying them is human understanding, Verstand. Understanding is, among other things, the capacity to think beyond the givens of nature and beyond any particular needs or desires we have. It is also the capacity to grasp the diversity of differences. Accordingly, see number 4, it is through his understanding that the human being brings multiplicity into needs and the means of satisfaction. Needs are also created by our imagination and by comparing ourselves with others. In this way, they become social. We need something because it is or will be fashionable in society. Human needs are thus not just natural needs of the body, but they are much more the products of our intelligence, desire for recognition, and our education. For Hegel, therefore, there is ultimately no clear distinction between natural and educated needs, between basic needs and the desire for luxury. Everything depends on the social context. A watch is a luxury in one circumstance and a necessity in another. That's Hegel's example. In Plato's Republic, Socrates begins to create a city in theory by identifying the needs that will create it. Needs for food, shelter, and clothing. These basic needs, however, merely ground what Glaucon calls a city for pigs. By contrast, we are told a city fit for humans must be a luxurious city, one filled with a multitude of things that go beyond what is necessary for a city. Yet Socrates contends that in such a city, in which people have overstepped the limit of their necessities, they will surrender themselves to the endless acquisition of money. A luxurious city will thus be one in which needs and desires have no limit. The same is true for Hegel in the system of needs. Here too, there is no limit to, no measure that governs our needs. This is due, however, not just to greed, but to the fact that human needs are multiplied by our understanding that can always go beyond any limit set for it. In the system of needs, our needs and desires can thus be multiplied to infinity, ins unendliche. This is true especially in the state of trade and industry. In this estate, human activity is governed not by nature, as in the agricultural estate, but by reflection and understanding. And it thus displays, I quote, insatiability, measurelessness, limitlessness. Yet not only does the multiplication of needs have no limit, the same is true of the division of labor. As needs become ever more specialized, so too does the labor required to meet them. Labor is thus divided by our understanding into activities that are more and more abstract or one-sided, even when they are in themselves complex, such as watchmaking. Understanding, however, not only goes beyond any qualitative limit and constantly generates desires for things with new qualities, but it also goes beyond any quantitative limit. Consumers thus want more and more of what they desire. Moreover, as society becomes more prosperous, more and more people want what is fashionable. Consequently, production has to be increased, and individual craftsmanship gives way gradually to mass production in factories. This in turn leads the understanding to divide productive labor into tasks that are more abstract, not only in being one-sided, but also in being simpler and more mechanical. As a result, a person's skill at his abstract work becomes greater, as does the volume of his output, Hegel says. As factory work becomes simpler and easier to carry out, Hegel argues, those understanding it lose mental stimulation and require less education, and their minds can thus become dulled or degraded, degradiert. Eventually, when work reaches its last abstraction and becomes quite mechanical, machines take over and workers step aside. Hegel describes this deadening Abstumpfung of the human being in a factory as a sad picture. Yet recall that this picture, or rather reality, is a product of a system driven by understanding. Understanding without limit or measure, that constantly seeks new means of satisfaction and more satisfaction, and that consequently pushes the division of labor to the point at which human activity becomes inhuman and mechanical. Even before the public authority or the police is introduced, therefore, civil society as a system of needs is already the state of the understanding, Verstandesstaat. That's paragraph 183, the philosophy of right. Now, in civil society, individuals seek to satisfy their particular needs, needs that can be multiplied without limit. In the administration of justice, however, the universal, in the form of abstract right, is the explicit object of concern and is asserted against particular individuals who violate it. The universal, in the form of right, is also the explicit object of the police, Polizei. Yet the role of the police differs from that of the courts, since it consists not in restoring the primacy of abstract right after its violation, but in protecting the public from such violation by bringing criminals to justice, and so guaranteeing, I quote, the undisturbed security of persons and property. Furthermore, the police are responsible not just for law and order, but also for realizing the moral right of individuals to secure their livelihoods, their Wohl, their welfare. The term police, therefore, refers to a public authority, öffentlicher Macht, whose task is to ensure, I quote, that particular welfare is treated as a right and actualized, as are paragraphs 230 and 235. And that's number 5. The police thus oversee matters of common interest so that people can continue unimpeded to acquire the means for satisfying their needs. The police thus protect public health, maintain streetlights and bridges, and keep the most common necessities of life available and affordable. The police also provide aid to those who fall into poverty through mechanization, bad luck, or their own extravagance, as Hegel puts it. They do so both by meeting the immediate needs of the poor and by helping to open new opportunities for them to find work. The public authority belongs with the judiciary to the executive power of the state. At this point in Hegel's argument, however, it is conceived not as a political entity, but as a welfare state, an institution that regulates economic activity and limits freedom of trade in order to protect and realize the right of individuals to satisfy their needs and secure their welfare. This public authority, however, regulates the economy in an external manner. It stands over against the sphere of particular interests as the power of the universal, and it intervenes in that sphere to protect the common interest, the universal right of particularity. In Hegel's logic, the universal that stands over against the particular is conceived as the abstract universal and belongs to the understanding, Verstand. The public authority, as the arm of the state that regulates civil society, is thus the state of the understanding, Verstandesstaat, in its explicit form. It asserts the authority of the universal over the system of particular needs that is itself driven by the understanding to endless growth, and in that sense is already the state of the understanding. So it's the state of the understanding governing the state of the understanding. Note, however, that the public authority does not control every aspect of economic life. It controls the price of basic necessities and combats fraud, but it imposes no limit or measure on the needs, desires, and choices of individuals. It does not, therefore, alter the principle governing the system of needs. People may still seek to maximize their personal satisfaction, wealth, and profit, provided they do not defraud or directly harm one another in so doing. The system thus remains geared towards measureless expansion, and competition between producers will still drive down costs and wages, leading to greater wealth for some and greater hardship for others. As a consequence, Hegel claims, police regulation of the economy cannot stop the emergence of systematic poverty. Poverty that is not just contingent, but the necessary product of the system of needs itself. What then does Hegel understand by poverty? It is to lack the necessary means of subsistence, the minimum required for life in society. This minimum, which varies from society to society, includes adequate food, clothing, and shelter, as well as the skills and financial resources needed to earn a living. Lacking this minimum deprives the poor in turn of their basic rights in civil society, their abstract right to own property, their moral right to satisfy their needs, and their ethical right to achieve satisfaction through their own activity and work. Poverty, accordingly, is not just an unfortunate side effect of a dynamic economy, but a fundamental injustice, Unrecht, that should be prevented. For Hegel, however, poverty involves not only material, but also spiritual deprivation. It deprives the poor of the sense of self-sufficiency and honor that one gains through work, because their work is menial or mechanical, or they are unemployed. And it also deprives them of recognition from their peers. So number 6, the poor man, Hegel states, feels excluded from everything and scorned. Poverty can also deprive those affected of the benefits of education and religion if they lack Sunday clothes. And it can prevent them from getting justice through the courts and protecting their health. Poverty can also give rise to an impoverished underclass or rabble, Pöbel. A rabble for Hegel is characterized not just by material deprivation, but also by indignation, Empörung, indeed envy and hatred against the rich, civil society, and government. This indignation arises because the poor feel deprived of their rights within a society they expect to protect those rights. Number 7, the rabble mentality is, I quote, consciousness of lacking rights under the presupposition of right. Moreover, the rabble feel that their poverty is not merely a natural occurrence, but the fault of others who continue to enjoy the rights and benefits of civil society. They thus experience their poverty quite rightly as an injustice inflicted upon them by society. This sense that their rights are not recognized by others leads the rabble in turn to disregard the rights of the latter and even to resort to crime. As Hegel puts it, the rabble feel released, entbunden, from respect for the rights of others. At the same time, they feel entitled, that they have the right to receive support without any corresponding labor on their part, and so exhibit what Hegel calls, rather unsentimentally, shamelessness. Hegel identifies three principal causes of systematic poverty, causes that are inherent in civil society as an externally regulated system of needs. The first cause is the division of labor. In civil society, understanding diversifies needs and divides labor into more specialized and one-sided tasks to meet those needs. Workers thereby become increasingly dependent on the branch of industry to which they belong and vulnerable to fluctuations in demand. Furthermore, as labor becomes ever more abstract and eventually quite mechanical, workers are replaced by machines, lose their livelihood, and thus fall into poverty. The second cause of poverty is increasing economic inequality. Those with greater skill attract more customers than others, and so build up more capital. This then allows them to reduce the profit they make from each transaction, to sell their goods more cheaply, and to attract even more customers. This in turn makes it harder for their competitors to make a living, and they become poorer relatively as the successful producers become wealthier. In the process, workers too become impoverished as producers lower their cost and thus the wages they pay. In pure civil society, therefore, the generation of wealth goes hand in hand with increasing poverty. Indeed, Hegel states, number 8, trade increases the more miserable the working class is, and thus the cheaper its labor, so that the merchant can sell more cheaply. And Hegel's phrase there is die arbeitende Klasse. The third cause of poverty is overproduction. The latter arises for two reasons. First, in civil society geared towards maximizing profit and wealth, productive capacity increases without limit or measure, especially through the introduction of machines. Second, mass production and economic competition impoverish workers and some producers, thereby diminishing their ability to consume what is produced. Eventually, production exceeds society's capacity for consumption, and so has to be cut back, causing unemployment and poverty. Note that in his account of poverty and its causes, Hegel does not just describe empirically what happens in certain modern states. He examines a distinctive form of freedom, namely civil society, or the system of needs regulated by a public authority. And he argues that this society, when taken on its own, without the corporations or the political state, gives rise logically, necessarily, to systematic poverty, and so to the negation of the very freedom it embodies. This does not mean that such poverty is inevitable in every modern state with a civil society, since Hegel thinks the right institutions and policies can prevent it from emerging. Yet he also thinks that poverty must arise in states that come close to being pure civil societies, as the example of 19th century Britain demonstrates, at least in Hegel's view. As we've seen, the more specific problem with civil society is that, especially in the commercial estate, it is governed by understanding that is without limit or measure. Its members are conscious of their right to own property and satisfy their needs, but their understanding reaches beyond any limits set for it, and so generates desires for ever more wealth and luxury. Wealth has thus, I quote, no qualitative limit in it, and consequently, civil society is engaged in unrestricted growth, paragraph 243. This drive to maximize production and consumption leads in turn to increasing economic inequality, overproduction, and poverty. The latter can thus itself increase without limit, which is why Hegel describes poverty in England as a cancer. Civil society, taken on its own and regulated only by the police, is therefore too rich to prevent poverty arising, for it is precisely its excess of wealth and productive power that creates poverty. An impoverished rabble is thus inseparable from a rich rabble that seeks to accumulate whatever it desires at whatever cost. Yet civil society is also too poor to solve the problem of poverty. For, despite an excess of wealth, I quote, it is not wealthy enough, i.e. its own resources are not sufficient to prevent an excess of poverty and the formation of a rabble. This is not to deny that the public authority can take measures to alleviate the plight of the poor. It can cap the prices of basic necessities, and it can provide financial support to the poor through a benefit system funded by taxation. The latter option, however, protects the livelihood of the needy without the mediation of work, and so gives them no feeling of self-sufficiency and honor, and indeed can lead to so-called welfare dependency. The public authority can also, and indeed is obliged to, provide opportunities for the poor to work. But in Hegel's view, this will increase the volume of production and so compound the problem. For the evil consists precisely in overproduction and the lack of the proportionate number of consumers. Some maintain that this problem can be avoided if, following Keynes, the poor are employed in public work, such as road building, that do not directly increase the supply of goods. But the problem with this suggestion, and also with state benefits, increasing exports and encouraging migration, is that they do not address the main issue. For none curbs the endless, measureless drive to maximize production and growth, the drive that for Hegel necessarily produces poverty. In this respect, civil society, regulated only by the police, remains too rich and too poor to prevent systematic poverty. For Hegel, systematic poverty violates right, and so must not arise in a truly free rational state. Moreover, Hegel does not claim that poverty is generated by a truly free rational state. It's generated by a civil society that is still merely a Verstandesstaat, an economic system driven by the understanding to seek limitless growth and regulated by the understanding in the form of the police, but without corporations or the political state. For Hegel, the corporations belong to civil society, but they do not form part of the Verstandesstaat. I have a reference for that if you're interested. Their role is rather to transform us from agents governed by understanding and selfish desire into ones that are rational and ethical. And in so doing, I contend, they prevent systematic poverty from arising in civil society. Corporations, as Hegel conceives them, are not, as Marx thought, mere vestiges of the medieval world. They are made necessary by the logic of freedom, by reason, and so are components of the modern rational state. The public authority protects the common interest of civil society and thereby preserves the universal contained in particularity, but it does so as an external regulatory body. According to the idea, however, particularity itself must have as its purpose the universal that is immanent in it, the universal that is particular to it. This universal, the interest common to a particular trade or community, rather than society as a whole, is recognized and affirmed within the corporation. In the estates, the Stände, individuals are already informed by their particular universal insofar as they acquire the skills, education, and rectitude appropriate to their estate. Yet, especially in the commercial estate, their principal concern remains their own particular interests. In a corporation, by contrast, the universal immanent in a particular sphere of activity is the explicit concern of its members. While pursuing their self-interest, therefore, individuals are also, I quote, raised to a conscious activity for a common end, their particular, common, or universal interest. Herein, Hegel claims, lies the rationality of the corporations in this fusion of particularity and universality. Corporations for Hegel are obviously not large profit-making companies such as Google. They are principally business or trade associations that include employers and employees working in a given area, such as hat making. They can, however, also include local communities and towns, and even religious communities. Within the corporations, its members continue to satisfy their particular desires through their labor. Yet their activity is no longer primarily selfish, because they also promote consciously the rights and interests of their fellows. Their activity is thus self-consciously ethical. I care for my own well-being, but, I quote, I also care for associates of the same trade, for something universal. Furthermore, the support that members receive from one another in good times and bad is recognized to be a right, not just charity. And the corporation in turn has the right to impose more duties on its wealthier members to use their wealth for common ends. Members of a corporation also receive recognition from one another for their skill in their profession. And in this way, each enjoys honor in his estate. Such recognition confirms the identity of each member as, for example, a hat maker or a carpenter, and thus establishes, I quote, that he is somebody in the eyes of his fellows. This recognition by one's peers means, in turn, that one does not have to seek recognition for oneself through external manifestations of success in one's trade. That is through accumulating conspicuous wealth. Recognition within a corporation, together with the ethical spirits and habits cultivated in the latter, thus overcomes what Lisa Herzog calls the risk of unbridled consumerism in civil society. Without the corporations, Hegel maintains, individuals enjoy no institutional recognition as subjects with particular abilities, rather than just abstract persons under the law. So they try to prove their worth and thereby gain general recognition through external evidence, namely wealth. There is, however, no intrinsic limit to such evidence, no point at which one is clearly rich enough to count as somebody. Individuals in a civil society without corporations are thus driven by their understanding to go beyond any limit they encounter and to strive for more and more wealth and luxury. In Hegel's terms, they seek the bad infinite. As Hegel reminds us, however, the love of luxury and extravagance is, quote, associated with the creation of a rabble. Civil society, regulated by the police, but without corporations, necessarily produces poverty as a counterpart to great wealth. Number 9. In England, Hegel remarks, there is the most monstrous poverty and rabble mentality. And a large part of this cancer is due to the removal of the corporations. Number 10, within corporations, by contrast, individuals no longer need to strive endlessly through understanding to go beyond their current wealth to prove their worth. Their selfhood no longer lies in an ever deferred beyond. Rather, they are confirmed in who they are, and so, as it were, returned to themselves by the recognition they receive from their associates. They enjoy thereby the true infinity, the infinity of reason rather than understanding, that consists in finding oneself in and through the other, in mutual recognition. The recognition we gain from our peers thus constitutes a measure or limit in our lives that we do not need constantly to transcend. We must, of course, work to maintain such recognition to satisfy our needs, yet with such recognition, the need to prove ourselves through conspicuous consumption vanishes. And with it, the major cause of systematic poverty is removed. The corporations thus provide a solution to the otherwise intractable problem of poverty in society by transforming an externally regulated system of needs into a society that is ethical and rational. Corporations also address the problem of overproduction by limiting their membership in the light of the universal context, and thus the number of people who can produce certain goods. In this way, they endeavor to keep production proportional to expected consumption and to avoid the excess production that puts people out of work. Such regulation can, of course, be undertaken by the police, but the latter is an external authority whose actions can appear malicious, gehässig. Within the corporations, by contrast, control of production is undertaken by the producers themselves, and so in that sense is self-imposed. It is also recognized as serving the common interests of these producers and thus as ethical. Overproduction for Hegel leads to people losing their jobs and falling into poverty. But one might worry that limiting production of certain goods itself deprives would-be producers of their livelihood. Yet for Hegel, one role of corporations is, I quote, to educate others so as to make them eligible for membership. Corporations can thus help those denied admission due to market saturation to acquire different skills that enable them to be admitted after all. Corporations remain therefore open rather than closed associations. By contrast, under freedom of trade without corporations, the great capitalists, as Hegel calls them, such as the English brewers, simply suppress their rivals and establish monopolies through their great capital, which are, I quote, the worst of all monopolies. No provision is made by such capitalists to help their rivals back into the market, but they are put out of business without any regard to their welfare. Corporations, in Hegel's view, will not prevent all poverty. Contingent poverty due to bad luck or changing demand remains a possibility. Yet in a society with corporations, both production and consumption will be ethical, and supply will be regulated to keep it in balance with demand. The main causes of systematic poverty, love of extravagance and overproduction, will thus be removed. Okay, now my conclusion. Civil society, as described in the PR, before the emergence of corporations, is an abstraction, and it does not exist in history in that pure form. In actual modern states with developed civil societies, but without corporations, the family, public education, religion, and a sense of common citizenship can all help to moderate the drive for increasing wealth. Not everyone in such states, therefore, will be as insatiable in their desires as in the society Hegel describes. Yet many will be insatiable. And if enough become great capitalists, this will lead to systematic poverty. Note too that a strong and pervasive sense of patriotism is not by itself sufficient to prevent such poverty from emerging. As we can see in 19th century England, which suffered from the most monstrous poverty, but also displayed great patriotism in Hegel's view. This is because although the state engenders a sense of common purpose within its citizens, it does not make them ethical in their particular social and economic activity. For Hegel, therefore, the principal solution to the problem of poverty does not lie in the political state, as some contend. It lies in the corporations, commercial and municipal, in which economic activity is raised to a conscious activity for a common end and thereby rendered ethical. Now, Hegel recognizes that corporations no longer form part of many modern states. They were part of civil society across Europe until Hegel's day, and in that sense were actual. So Hegel's theory of the corporation is not utopian, yet they were abolished because of the modern insistence on the principle of abstract equality and freedom of trade. To put it another way, they were abolished by modern understanding. But this does not alter the fact that they're logically necessary components of a truly free and rational state. So for Hegel, reason in the modern world demands that they be reintroduced for their own sake, but also to address the problem of poverty. Now, one familiar objection to Hegel's corporations is that they exclude certain people and leave them exposed to the ravages of the market. There are, however, responses to this objection. First, for 11, although Hegel says in 1817-18 that day laborers and servants are not members of corporations, he also states in the same lectures, I quote, that no one in the state may be permitted not to be a member of an association. Moreover, Hegel includes among recognized corporations not just business and trade associations, but also local communities and parishes. So in this respect, every member of the rational state can belong to a corporation. Note too that corporations do not just serve their own members, but again, to quote, educate others so as to make them eligible for membership. Furthermore, they temper unbridled consumerism across the whole economy and thereby benefit everyone, even if some individuals, for whatever reason, do not belong to a corporation. David James expresses a related concern about Hegel's corporations, namely that they exclude the unemployed and by implication the poor. But this objection overlooks another important feature of Hegel's theory, namely that the role of the corporations in the PR is not to deal with an existing problem of poverty, but to prevent systematic poverty arising in the first place. Such poverty is made necessary by pure civil society, regulated only by the police, but it is no longer a logical necessity in a society organized into corporations. Indeed, systematic poverty as an injustice, an Unrecht, has no place in a free, rational state at all. So in that respect, there should be no poor in such a state for the corporations to exclude. Members of corporations could, of course, still fall into contingent poverty or lose their jobs through mechanization, but they would then be entitled to the support of their association. The only circumstance in which systematic poverty would exist outside the corporations would be when they are being introduced or reintroduced into a state that lacks them and is governed by the extravagance of the rich. In the PR, however, Hegel is not describing a historical situation in which poverty is already present. He is setting out the logic of freedom and arguing that civil society, organized throughout into corporations, would be a society of genuine freedom without systematic poverty. But civil society organized without corporations would be a society with systematic poverty. Hegel's conception of ethical consumption and production, which generate neither extreme wealth nor systematic
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much for that very rich and thought-provoking talk. I now give the floor to Bernardo.
Thank you. So good afternoon. I'd like to start by thanking Karin de Boer and the organizers of the seminar for inviting me. It is a pleasure to respond to a very interesting paper by Stephen, whom I admire and with whom I've learned a lot over the years. So to save time, I will not be summarizing the paper's main claims. We've just heard them. I would like to move directly to my interpretation of the paper and specifically to four main issues I think are worth discussing. The first one concerns the relationship between the normative and the historical dimensions of the philosophy of right. The paper argues that Hegel's work aims to reveal the form that freedom must take if it is to be true freedom, regardless of whether or not that of a philosophy. A concrete illustration of a philosophical concept, the concept of freedom, whose meaning has already been established. So in my view, this kind of reading fails to explain why Hegel regards the philosophy of history as an integral part of the system and why he takes it to be no less than the highest stage of the philosophy of objective spirit. Moreover, I think it's worth noting that world history is already part of the philosophy of right itself. In the third subsection of the chapter on the state, Hegel mentions the world historical stages that will later be expanded and detailed in the philosophy of history. And he even claims that the right of the world spirit is the highest right of all. So all of this seems to suggest that the way in which freedom takes shape in the world is not just an illustration of something we already knew at a conceptual level. Instead of offering a timeless recipe for what a state should be, and then noting that it has been actualized, Hegel seems to be saying that that actualization itself is philosophically relevant, that it is itself an important part of the definition of freedom. So I'd be curious to know what Stephen thinks about this, if he agrees that there is a potential underestimation here of the philosophical role played by the philosophy of history, and how that can change the way we understand what's going on in the philosophy of rights, not least with respect to the problem of poverty. Okay, so the second issue I'd like to bring up is more directly related to Hegel's corporations. Let me start by saying I agree with the paper's main claim, namely that it is in the corporations that Hegel's proposed solution to poverty is to be found. I think the paper does a great job in demonstrating why this is so. However, I am not as convinced that the corporations, as Hegel presents them, provide a successful solution to the problem of poverty. And that is because I am not so sure that they can be fully defended against some of the objections that have been raised against them. One of these objections concerns the limited inclusivity of the corporations. The paper responds to Hegel's infamous claim that day laborers, Tagelöhner, and servants cannot be members of corporations by arguing, A, that Hegel is not always consistent on this point, which I think is fair enough, and B, that these individuals can belong to other non-professional corporations. But if the main source of the ethical disposition the corporations are supposed to promote is the shared work experience of its members, the fact that they do the same kind of work and are therefore capable of recognizing in others the skills required to do it, then it is hard to see how a parish or any other non-professional association would do the trick. Is it the case then that only professional corporations can generate the attitudinal change Hegel argues for? My third observation concerns a further objection related to the composition of the corporations, and more specifically to the fact that, unlike trade unions, the corporations can include both employers and employees. In the stage of civil society, when describing the relationship between workers and capitalists, Hegel is clear about the fundamental incompatibility of their interests. This is especially the case in the later lecture notes on the philosophy of right from 1822 onwards, where Hegel explicitly notes that to increase their profits and thereby survive in a competitive market, capitalists have to cut wages, which is of course contradictory with the workers' interests. In the corporations, on the other hand, we have the opposite scenario. Capitalists and workers come to realize that their interests are not only not incompatible, but in fact complementary, insofar as they are both committed to the success of their trade. So this means that this collective sense of belonging would lead the wealthier associates to not want to accumulate capital beyond a certain limit, because they would not need wealth to obtain social recognition, and or because they would be more sensitive to the welfare of the poorer associates. And note that I say that they would not want to accumulate capital because it would ultimately have to be a voluntary decision. If the argument is simply that the corporations can force the wealthier members to alter their behavior, we'd be returning to the external regulatory logic of the Polizei and the Verstandesstaat. So a standard Marxist objection would be that this solution is naive because this transformation cannot be realistically expected, and because the accumulation of capital is a structural feature of a capitalist economy, which cannot be eliminated through what seems to be, in effect, a psychological transformation. To which we could counter-argue, and I think the paper does this to some extent, that Hegel is not really concerned with realism. His approach is not sociological nor psychological. What counts is rather what is rationally required for freedom to attain its true form. But this kind of response, I think, can only get us so far, because Hegel himself despite his conceptual approach, is working with basic assumptions as to how individuals can be expected to behave under certain social conditions. His point, after all, is precisely that the corporations will promote a certain kind of behavior on the part of their members. The problem becomes more evident, I believe, when we consider the industrial economy taking shape in Hegel's time. So in a small-scale handicraft-based economy, where work relations are still centered around the learning of a specific craft and the subsequent attainment of professional independence, the masters and the apprentices have a relatively similar work experience, and the kind of empathy Hegel talks about is therefore easier to imagine. In a full-blown capitalist economy with an intense division of labor and no immediate prospects of professional independence, the attitudinal change envisaged by Hegel is much less evident, partly because the work experience of a worker in the assembly line is radically different from that of a high-ranking manager, for example, although they both can be said to belong to the same branch of industry. So, is this not a problem for Hegel's proposed solution? Finally, my fourth question relates to another objection that is not, as far as I can tell, addressed in the paper, namely, the risk that corporations might reproduce at a higher level the atomistic logic of civil society by competing among themselves for political influence, state funding, or other similar advantages. Hegel proposes to avoid this by having an elected spokesperson represent each corporation in a wider legislative assembly, which will allow the different corporations to recognize each other as meaningful social agents whose needs should be acknowledged and respected. However, the source of this mutual recognition is no longer a shared work experience, which Hegel had argued was the condition for corporate solidarity, but simply the idea that the different representatives will recognize their common interests through public debate. So a kind of proto-Habermasian solution based on a wide communicative exchange. But isn't this too thin a foundation in which to ground the transformation Hegel is arguing for? Okay, so there will be much more to discuss, but I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much for bearing with me.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much for all those points that you've raised. Perhaps we don't have time for a comprehensive response on each of these, and we can carry some of them over to the general Q&A, but are there any specific responses that you want to give now, Stephen Houlgate?
Yeah, well, just thank you, Bernardo. Those were very good and probing questions. So let me see if I can say something in a few minutes. First of all, I absolutely think the philosophy of history is philosophically relevant to our understanding of freedom. It just doesn't determine the things that are determined in the philosophy of right. So if we want to understand what right is in its different forms, we can do that without reference to history. And I think Hegel thinks that there is a logic of right that requires right to take the abstract, the moral, the ethical, and so on, those different forms. But of course, you pointed out, although I think you worded it slightly different from the way I would word it, that the philosophy of history is actually the concluding part of the philosophy of right. And so the last understanding we have to have of freedom as right is that it's not just abstract right, moral right, and freedom in the state. It is historical. Freedom develops historically. And indeed, the very freedom that's articulated in the philosophy of right, as it emerges in history, is realized only more or less. And that more or less is philosophically necessary. So I absolutely think that, that the philosophy of history is integral to our understanding of freedom. It is philosophically relevant, but I think it comes after the philosophy of right. And indeed, I think Hegel's, it's not that Hegel has, what I want to object to is the idea that Hegel has a historical account of right in the philosophy of right. I want to say he has a normative account of right in the philosophy of right, and indeed a normative account of history. Freedom must be historical, and it must unfold in these different ways, and only the unfolding of freedom in that way counts as history. people misunderstand Hegel really, really badly in this respect. They think Hegel's just taking history, everything that happens, and sort of blithely saying, well, it all is progressive. No, he's not doing that. He's saying what counts as history with a capital H is precisely that set of changes that moves freedom forward. What doesn't do that doesn't count as history. Now, you may disagree with that, but that's Hegel's view. So that would be my remark to the first point, and I don't think we're that far apart. On the second question, which is a very good one, I guess I don't think professional corporations are the only space in which that attitudinal change can happen. No, I think Hegel mentions Gemeinden, communities, and religious communities. The key idea is particularity. This is why I mentioned those terms, universal, particular, I mean, individual, I didn't mention so much, but that also plays a role. I think these are absolutely vital for understanding the structure of the philosophy of right. That what happens in civil society is the particularity dominates. Then in the administration of justice and in the Polizei, the moment of universality is asserted that intervenes in particularity, but if you like, for the sake of particularity. And then we get this fusion of particularity with its immanent universal. And I think that happens in all of the corporations he's talking about. So I guess my simple answer would be, no, I don't think it has to be just the professional associations, but that parishes and communities also count, provided they provide a way of habituating people to be ethical in the pursuit of their particular interests, whatever they happen to be. Okay, realism. I mean, that's this is the Marxian critique. I don't think the Marxian critique really holds, because of course one of the things that Marx is telling us is, in a sense, there isn't such a thing as just a given historical reality. The realities are products of human practices. Now, where I think Hegel and Marx differ is that Hegel thinks that understanding, Verstand, plays a much more determining role in constituting what we take to be material economic activity than Marx does. I think for Marx, what's more crucial is the development of more powerful means for producing goods that meet our needs, and then the social and economic changes that are brought about by that. But I think for Hegel, those changes occur within a context of understanding or reason, and that what's happened in modernity is that understanding has just gone mad. And one of the expressions of that is the abolition of the corporations. And remember, the corporations were part of the Prussian civil order in the 1790s. They were abolished under the Loi Le Chapelier in the French Revolution. And they were also abolished, and we still have, antitrust laws and things now. We don't like the idea of groups of producers getting together because we tend to suspect that that's going to stifle innovation and all the rest of it. And I think Hegel would say to Marx, in inverted commas, don't overlook the fact that what you take to be an economic reality is also a product of a certain form of mindedness, a certain way of thinking. Now, they can disagree about that, I guess, but I've got other objections to Marx, which perhaps we could talk about later, which have to do with the relation of quantity and quality. If people are interested in talking about that, then I'd be happy to go into that. The last point is perfectly fair, Bernardo. If I'd been allowed another hour, or this is actually a published paper now, another 10,000 words, I think, yes, one would have to, and Hegel, one would have to address, and Hegel himself does address, this problem of ensuring that corporations do not become reified. And I think that, broadly speaking, I guess I agree with what you've said, that what is meant to prevent that is their incorporation into the higher structure of the state. I think it's okay, you made this sound Habermasian, as if somehow, you know, all we need to do is kind of talk and communicate with one another, and that sort of does it. No, I don't. I think there will be real regulation from the state. Although remember also that when Hegel's talking about the executive, the corporations provide a check on the excessive power of the executive too. It works both ways. But I think there will be, you know, possible regulations that can prevent the corporations getting out of hand. I think also that the fact that corporations are represented in the legislature is itself important for Hegel, because what it means is that Hegel's legislature isn't really representative. It's presentative, if you like. What Hegel wants are different economic interests, not represented in the legislature, but present in the legislature, and that's meant to be assured by the electoral system that he has. And the last point, I suppose, let's not forget that political patriotism, as he calls it, although I don't think it's enough to prevent poverty, is effective. I think Hegel thinks it's significant. He makes reference to it in paragraph 268, and it's clearly meant to be very significant. And so that sense of being common citizens is also meant to prevent corporations becoming sort of reified. So I think a combination of regulation by the state, of the developing of a common sense of citizenship, and of bringing those interests together in legislature, where the interests themselves actually confront one another and have to come to a common agreement. I think that seems to be Hegel's answer to your question. Whether that's sufficient, I'm not sure, but I think you're absolutely right. That needed to be discussed, and I thank you for highlighting that. Maybe that's just for the if that will do as I mean, inadequate answers, but I think I'll stop at that point to let other people come in, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you very much for that exchange. And with that, we open the floor to the audience. So please use the raise hand function, or if that doesn't work, the chat, and I'll call on you in the order that your hand appears. So I'm just going to read out the name as it appears for me. So the first one, it says Janet iPhone.
Yes, my name's actually Alan, but that's the email address. Just a very, I hope not too simple a question for Stephen Houlgate. In this picture that he paints, what role or what part do trade unions play?
In the picture that, well, hello, Alan, first of all, nice to see you again. It's been a long time. First, none. And you've got to think why. Remember that I read the philosophy of right as an account of freedom, account of what freedom means. It's normative. Now, Hegel thinks that the corporations are necessary. So those associations in which both employers and employees come together, as Bernardo described, those are necessary components. But of course, they were abolished. We didn't have them in the 19th century. I mean, we do have, one thing I had to miss out of the paper, we do have certain regulatory bodies now that are a little bit similar and that regulate different professions. I mean, if you think of the medical profession or the legal profession, there are systems of that license people to become you know, doctors or lawyers. So we have structures that are a little bit like corporations, but we don't have a thoroughgoing corporate system in that sense. What we have is a system in which, again, Bernardo described very eloquently the way that in which the interests of employers and employees grew apart. And my understanding of it is that trade unions were a response to that. Trade unions belong to a world in which there are what Hegel calls classes. But classes don't belong in a free state. Stände, states, belong in a free state. Now, we live in a world in which there are classes, in which there are trade unions, in which they're necessary. But that's because we don't live in a free state. We live in a state that we take to be free in certain respects, but which lacks what many aspects that Hegel thinks belong to the state of freedom. And in fact, when you look around the European countries of Hegel's own time, Hegel thinks that each one in some ways is, you know, rational. So
Can I just
anyway,
come
sorry.
back?
Yes, go ahead.
Just one point that you made when you say we do have regulatory bodies, for example, in the medical profession. Now, I belong to the medical profession, and I would be the last one, and my colleagues will not like this, to hear this, to advocate the sort of regulatory process that the medical profession has, which I personally think is, let's say, far from perfect.
Right, but with respect, and that's looking at the wrong way around. The issue is not, let's look at the society we live in, let's recognize how terrible certain things are. At least that's not how Hegel proceeds. What Hegel tries to do is look at different forms of freedom that he thinks are necessary and understand what negatives, if I can put it that way, are generated by each of them. Now, he starts with abstract right, and he thinks abstract right is a necessary form of freedom. But without going into all the detail, we need certain other institutions to alter the mindset, if you like, to bring about the attitudinal change. And that's what you've got to think about. Is that right? You know, is it right that civil society left to its own devices will produce poverty? People might say, no, it's not right. Okay, well, it's not right. Let's think about that. Then we don't need the corporations. If it is right, then is Hegel's solution of introducing corporations the right one logically? Now, there may be practical problems of introducing it. It may be impossible to introduce it. But, you know, it's impossible in America to get rid of guns. But look at whether they perform a function that is roughly like what Hegel's got in mind, and whether they can be reformed in directions that he might recommend. All right, I better stop on that one because I think there might be other people coming in.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is from Andrew Buchwalter. You're muted, I think.
Undialectical view of the relationship of the corporation to the political. I mean, it seems to me that there's a more intricate, and I mean, one you've already addressed or has been addressed, and that Hegel himself says that corporations can't rely on their own, need some sort of state regulation to ensure that they're balanced. So that's one thing. But he also says that the corporations are characterized by the inherent likeness. This is in paragraph 251, the inherent likeness of their members. And for a state that relies, for a political community that relies on some sort of recognition of the other, that is itself not sufficient. So there has to be some mechanism by which members, corporations and their members can recognize one another. And that's something further furnished by the political community. It can't just be furnished by civil society alone. Third, freedom. I mean, freedom is recognition, but it's not simply to be recognized by public institutions. Freedom for Hegel is also to be a citizen and to participate in your own freedom. And that's what he characterizes as a distinctly political freedom as opposed to the freedom of civil society. Now, it seems to me that that type of political freedom is present in corporations, or could be seen there, but I didn't hear that so much. And then finally, you know, that even when Hegel does, I mean, this would sort of go to your own point, but even when Hegel does emphasize the state, he presents corporations, what did he say, as the corporations with the family are pillars of public freedom. So that the corporations do participate in the state, and the state relies on the corporation. I mean, what exactly means by pillars of public freedom, you know, that's itself another issue. But in all those respects, it seems to me that the relationship of the corporation to the political is maybe for Hegel more elaborate, and maybe more elaborate than you presented, although I think you agree with that in the end. So thank you.
Good. Well, thank you, Andrew. It's good to see you again. Yes, I think with respect, in a way, you're asking for a whole new section to the paper, which obviously that I wasn't able to give. So let me just explain what I was trying to do. I had a very specific focus, and that was on the issue of poverty. And I'm trying to, you know, address something that's been discussed by Avenieri, Alan Wood, and lots of people, Frank Ruder, over the years. And that was my very specific interests. And so that's the first point. The second point is a methodological feature of the way I read the philosophy of right. Although ultimately I take it Hegel wants us to understand all the aspects of freedom together, I think each form of right has to be understood in its own terms in relation to the ones that precede them, but it can't anticipate what's coming later. So that we look at abstract right in terms of abstract right and in relation to choice. We look at morality in relation to abstract right. Similarly, when we get to civil society and the corporations, we can't make reference to the concern. Now, you're absolutely right that when we move into the political, first of all, you're right to say that freedom also involves citizenship and being part of a political state. And you're also right to say that corporations, as Bernardo pointed out, have a role to play within that political state. And so it's not sufficient to say that freedom, as it were, if you like, stops with the corporations. It doesn't. But I wanted to suggest that the decisive contribution that Hegel is making towards understanding the problem of poverty is to highlight the role that the corporations play in transforming us from beings governed by understanding into beings governed by reason. And that if you took those corporations out and simply relied on the operations of the political state, that would not, well, either it would just be external, which wouldn't do any good, or it would be too abstract. Just having a shared consciousness of being citizens is too abstract to bring about an actual transformation in my activity as a hat maker or as a carpenter or whatever. whereas the corporations do that. So that was so I was giving a deliberately partial view, but obviously in a grander picture, I completely agree with you, Andrew. Yes, that the freedom needs to be extended into the political, and we need to have a clearer account of how the corporations and indeed civil society more generally fits into that political state. But I think that was beyond the confines of the paper. So I wasn't in any way trying to deny what you're saying. I just didn't have an opportunity to comment on that. So I think I'll leave it there if I can.
Can I have a just quick follow-up question to that? Yeah, I understand that. But still, I guess my final point was, is there a political dimension to the, or what is the political dimension, if any, to the corporation itself? I mean, when poverty is not simply lack of economic resources. Poverty for Hegel is also disenfranchisement and the lack of opportunity to participate in public life. I mean, he talks of the poor don't even have the clothes and the training to participate in public fora. So there should be some expectation that one does participate in public fora. And I guess the question is, what would that mean in the corporation? I mean, so there is a political dimension to the corporation itself, and not just
right. But one's got to separate out. I think that's a very interesting idea that you put out there. If one's got to separate out two different ideas. Part of Hegel's understanding of corporations at the level that I'm looking at within civil society must involve, because it involves reciprocal recognition, it must obviously involve participation in understanding how that corporation develops and so on. I mean, there's nothing in what Hegel says that indicates that corporations have to be essentially hierarchical bodies in which one lot of people tell another lot of people what to do. But I don't think that's what you mean. I think you want to think about the participation in the political arena of that Hegel identifies. I think the difficulty there is that Hegel doesn't think that Hegel's not a modern Democrat. I don't think he thinks that all individuals need to participate in that political arena. What he thinks is that their interests need to be represented in the political arena. And that indeed, in a system in which individuals' voices get heard in that political arena, it's very easy for their interests not to be heard. And I know that's not a very comfortable thing to say nowadays, but that's Hegel's view. And so what he wants is within the lower house, there to be representation of the corporations and their interests in that body. And that's what's crucial. Whereas, of course, what we have is a different system where we have a majority. I mean, you've got to ask nowadays, in our parliament, well, either in the US or in the UK or anywhere else, to what extent are all the significant interests in the society genuinely represented there? Well, they're not. And they're not because we have majority rule. And that's not going to allow those interests to be represented. So I think Hegel doesn't think that each member of the corporation, in a sense, has to participate directly in the political order. But the political order has to have a place for the interests, and in that sense, the voice of those members of the corporations. And so what you will have is you will presumably have discussions in the corporations, which then get fed through into the legislature via the representative of that corporation there. Now, that's not a system we're ever going to introduce. A lot of people would say it's anti-democratic. But as I say, I think Hegel's worry is that the democratic system that we have and that he was aware of risks silencing certain interests. Interests just don't get expressed in the legislature. So you say poverty is being deprived of the right to participate in the political sphere. Interestingly, Hegel doesn't mention that as part. He mentions, that you can't go to church, you don't get healthcare, you don't get the education. But if we want to say, what does poverty deprive us of? It deprives us of the right to have our interests given voice in the legislature. That's what matters for Hegel. And so I think this idea of a legislature that reflects genuine interests of society rather than just the largest number of voices, which is what we tend to do. I mean, we have a very quantitative way of thinking about how to fill the legislature. You know, and even if we do it in proportional representation, it's still an essentially quantitative way of getting representatives in that house. Whereas Hegel wants a qualitative way of getting representation of the legislature. As I say, I doubt we'll ever do anything like that, but I think that's his idea. So, but anyway, sorry, those remarks are no doubt inadequate, but thank you anyway for your comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we have time for a final question, which is in the chat. So I'm going to read it out. It comes from Marcos Faceja. So he writes, I agree with almost everything you said regarding the corporations and Hegel's project in general. More specifically, for those who like to keep the capitalist system but argue for public authority as a solution to avert the problem of poverty, you have clearly shown how this does not help to overcome systematic poverty. One point I would like to elaborate on is related to the relation between the corporations and the state. In the abstract, you stated that, quote, the state also engenders a sense of common purpose within its citizens, but it does not make them ethical in their particular social and economic activity as the corporations do. Did not Hegel, end of quote, did not Hegel recognize the limits of corporations to fully solve the problem of poverty, especially due to the competition among them? Isn't the state as a sort of extended unity that incorporates various corporations required to fill that gap? End of question.
Good question. Thank you for your question. This is, I suppose, picking up themes that have already been highlighted. Hegel is aware, not so much of the competition among them, but of what he refers to as a kind of reification of the corporations. I think he's aware of what happened in France in the 18th century and the role that the Parlement played in France, for example. He's aware of the the power of medieval corporations as well. So I think he is aware of that problem. But interestingly, to my knowledge, he doesn't particularly discuss the role that integrating the corporations in the state can play in solving the problem of poverty. The solution to the problem of poverty seems to be, in Hegel's view, provided at the level of the corporations, and of course within each corporation and each community and each parish, that would take a subtly different form. I think, though, that the implication of the question, namely that the relations between the corporations also need to have some oversight over them, and also perhaps need to be infused with an ethical spirit, and that the state plays a role in doing that, is a perfectly good one. I have no objection in adding that to the picture. As I say, I don't think Hegel sees that aspect of the relation between the corporations and the state as contributing to the problem of poverty, except, I suppose, indirectly, although I'm speculating here, that if the corporations are represented, present indeed, in the legislature, and the legislature has a vital role in determining the laws that govern the state and the economy as a whole, then of course indirectly they do have an input into measures that are then taken by the whole state to alleviate poverty. There's one issue that people haven't mentioned, and I'm surprised at that, but I'm going to mention it anyway as a possible problem with the account that I've given, just so you've got it on the record. And that is, the external pressures coming from other countries abroad. That one of the things and I don't think that's appropriate in this part of the philosophy of right, because as I said, this is relevant perhaps to Bernardo's first question, because I don't think Hegel is thinking here of ethical life in its historical position. That comes later. But I suppose if I'm going to give a fuller account of Hegel on poverty, having discussed this issue in the philosophy of right, then perhaps the next stage that one should look at is, well, what difference does it make for the state and its corporations to be in historical relation or geographical relation for that matter, to other states that can actually put economic pressure on a state. Can states be impoverished by the competition they have with other states? Now that, it seems to me, is an issue in a sense for the philosophy of history rather than the philosophy of right. And given that nobody mentioned it, I thought I should mention it. It's something that needs to be thought about, and I haven't thought about it here. But I think I'll stop at that point if that's okay.
We have a second final question. So
Oh, right.
a final question from Karen de Boer. Go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah, okay, sorry, I'm postponing the end of this session, but I wanted to ask you one thing, Stephen. I liked your paper. I think it's very clear and also faithful to Hegel's own account. But one of my worries is that it is an account that's very hard to reconcile with the reality of capitalism. So I think the picture is too rosy. Yeah. So on Hegel's picture, and of course Hegel was very much aware of the problems of capitalism as he knew it. On Hegel's picture, we put all the skilled workers in corporations, and all the non-skilled workers, the day laborers, we put in churches and parishes, where they are taught how to behave nicely. And that's about it. Yeah, so it's not going to change their condition. It's just supporting capitalism. Yes, maybe it will be a somewhat softer version of capitalism, but it will still be capitalism. And the division between those who happen to be in a corporation and those who happen to be outside of the corporation is going to create huge social problems, it seems to me. And just referring to the parishes as social structures that should be able to deal with the problem of the day laborers and maybe the rebel, I find not convincing at all. So I think that if Hegel wants to maintain this picture, I think that he should take one more step and go for the abolishment of capitalism.
Okay, wow, a lot in there. First of all, you talk about the reality of capitalism. Hegel doesn't think there is such a thing as just the reality of capitalism. He thinks capitalists, and he uses the word capitalist, are created. And they are created not just by material necessities, they are created by a mentality. This is why I insisted on the role of Verstand. This contrast between Verstand and Vernunft is absolutely decisive for me. That there is no such thing as just the reality of capitalism. It has emerged. The corporations were deliberately abolished. Freedom of trade has been deliberately promoted. It's been promoted as an idea. And so that's the first thing I would say. This is a world we have created for ourselves. Even Marx says that, that capitalism has created a world in its own image. So I think that's important. I think this idea somehow that there is, a set of ideas in Hegel and then there's a reality of capitalism misses the point that that reality is constructed and sustained consciously or unconsciously by a mentality that thinks everyone should work for themselves to accumulate more wealth. The economy should be grown more at the expense of nature, for example, and the environment. I mean, the environmentalists would also, I think, agree with this. That's why I put that in at the end, that the idea that the economy should be geared towards maximizing growth is an idea. It doesn't need to be like that. There isn't just a reality there. That's the first point I would say. So changing the mentality and requiring institutions within that mentality, within which that mentality is changed, I think that's something important. And I think that's something that the environmentalists could also learn from. It's not good enough just to make moral complaints. We need institutional change. That's point one. Secondly, you talked about the people excluded from the corporations. And you mentioned the rabble, but remember, in a free state, there is no rabble. This is really, really important. That, in fact, I'm guilty really of creating confusion myself. Hegel is not offering a solution to the problem of poverty. He is trying to argue that a certain form of state, a certain form of social organization, would not allow poverty to arise in the first place. That a certain form of social organization makes poverty necessary systematically. It's unavoidable when it's there in its pure form, but another form wouldn't allow it to arise in the first place. So now for me, for anyone to talk about Hegel's solution to the problem of poverty makes it sound as if Hegel thinks there is poverty and how on earth can I do something about it? And that's not what Hegel's interested in. He's interested in what would a free state have to look like such that poverty would not be part of it. Do we live in a state like that now? No, we don't. Okay, what are our options? Continuing merrily as we go along, or think about the necessary forms of freedom and try, within the limits of political practice, to reorganize our society in a way that that freedom requires. This is why those passages from the lectures, when he said, it's the time is now to form corporations, but people don't want to do it because they're governed by abstract principles. You could see that Hegel was thinking that's crucial. Third point, abolish capitalism. Abolish, well, as you know, I think Hegel disagrees with Marx on this one, that what you can't do is abolish the system of production and exchange. And it's not just that you can do it. What you shouldn't do is abolish the system of production and exchange. And that's what Hegel's mainly concerned about, that civil society is a system of needs in which the division of labor requires the production and exchange of goods. Now, if I'm just allowed a couple of minutes or a minute perhaps to say something, Marx, as I understand it, thinks that that generates the notion of exchange value. And once exchange value becomes part of that economic system, then obviously goods become commodified, but so does human labor power. Human labor power becomes commodified because of the very institution of exchange value. How do you, as it were, recover the humanity of people? You get rid of exchange value. You get rid of money, but you also get rid of any system of production and exchange. You put the means of production in public hands, and you have the system described in the Gotha program of from each according to his ability, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And Marx is open about that. He sees no possibility of redeeming that economic system because the problem is value, exchange value. Hegel doesn't agree. He didn't know about Marx, but I mean, in anticipation, doesn't agree that the very idea of exchange value automatically commodifies human labor power. It doesn't automatically do that. It all depends on how workers and employees are regarded within productive enterprises. And they don't need to, the simple fact that I might be worth, X, Y, or Z doesn't mean that you lose sight of my humanity. So there's not the same need in Hegel to abolish the system of production and exchange. What there is a need to inform that system with reason rather than Verstand. So sorry, but that's what I think is what Hegel's response to the Marxian idea would be. And so abolishing capitalism, I mean, assuming we're not going to go backwards, we're going to go forward to something, would mean having a system in which there's no more production and exchange, no more exchange value. But then you're missing the particularity of freedom that Hegel thinks is crucial. And B, you're doing something that's not necessary because exchange value is not the problem that Marx thinks it is. Do you want to come back on that? Just because I said rather a lot.
Well, so very briefly, I'm thinking you cannot have your cake and eat it. That is to say, you cannot, maintain capitalism and keep only the nice bits of it, and assume that we can simply get rid of all the nasty bits. I think it's not plausible. And I think that Hegel has a problem there, or that everyone who, takes Hegelian ideas as a model has a problem that cannot be simply pushed aside.
Well, I guess I don't agree. I think there is a foundationalism that underlies your question. You're assuming that capitalism somehow is a foundational reality, and I dispute that. I don't think it is. I think it's a reality that we happen to be inhabiting at the minute, and we've been inhabiting for a while because we've put ourselves in it. We've created it, and it's not a matter of picking out the nice bits. It's a matter of amending it, revising it, in light of a different mentality, and recognizing that it's sustained by a mentality. And I think this is where Marx and Hegel disagree, and I'm afraid I'm with Hegel on this one, that Verstand is what's doing the work, because it's Verstand that distinguishes us from the animals. Non-human animals and human animals are distinguished not by their animality, but by the fact that humans have Verstand. And that's why I made that comparison with Plato's Republic, and even, and Glaucon and Socrates, when Glaucon says this is just a city for pigs, okay, they all agree we've got to go beyond this, we've got to have a luxurious city. And they all recognize there that what that will mean is that we lose measure. We're suddenly in this space of unrestricted, measureless greed. I think Hegel says, yes, absolutely. And it's human Verstand that does this. But Verstand's no more a reality, a foundational reality, than capitalism is. We don't need to live in a world governed by Verstand. We can become rational. We can have institutions of mutual recognition. We can respect one another. And there's nothing in capitalism, as Hegel understands it, that prevents that. Now, Marx, may have a different view, but I think Marx is missing something important. And it's odd for someone who has such a historical perspective as Marx to think somehow that, not that I think Marx himself ever uses that. I mean, a number of people here have used this, but I don't know that Marx has ever said, this is a reality and it's naive to think it could be different, because Marx recognizes that capitalism is also a historical product. But I don't think he's as aware as Hegel is of the extent to which a certain mentality sustains it. So that would be my response. Because otherwise, Karen, we are either, we've got to be Schopenhauer, which I'm working on at the minute, and got to be pessimists and think, well, we're just in a mess and that's it. Or we've got to be utopians and think, well, let's get rid of capitalism. But then what are you going to put in its place? A system, I guess, of, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Yeah, maybe. But then, you lose the focus on particularity, at least Hegel thinks you do anyway. There are other risks, as we know, about from getting from A to B, or from A to C rather, through B. There are historical risks in making that move. But anyway, I think we'll have to disagree on that one, or leave it at that point, and maybe pick up the conversation at some future time. But thank you all for your questions. These have been most illuminating, and I hope the talk has been thought-provoking for you too, because it's been a very interesting debate for me, and I appreciate all the questions from you and from Bernardo in particular. And thank you all for your participation.
All right, thank you. Perhaps we can pick up some of these issues in the informal part. I will leave the link open for those that can stay. So before we bring the formal part to close and thank our speakers, I would like to invite you to a conference that will be held at KU Leuven. The link should be in the chat now. It's on German idealism and the question of colonialism. So touches perhaps on, we'll touch perhaps on some of the issues that we've discussed today. There will be some Hegel in relation to his take on colonialism and in relation to the uses of the German idealists by more recent post-colonial theorists. So it is online, so do come to that if you can. Okay, so I'd like to thank both of our speakers, Stephen Houlgate and Bernardo Ferro, for their very interesting discussion and for the very rich talk that we had afterwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Wonderful talk.
Thank you very much indeed. While people are deciding whether or not to stay, Pavel, can I just make one brief comment? When you mentioned the question of colonialism, I think it's worth noting that Hegel talks in the philosophy of right about exporting the poor and sending them abroad before he introduces the corporation. That is important. That solution, namely just export the poor to somewhere else, is an admission of defeat by civil society in many ways. It's very interesting that Hegel doesn't think that's going to do it. That is not the solution to the problem of poverty, because it doesn't alter the principle that's at work in civil society. Yeah. It just exports the problem elsewhere and allows people to carry on at home. So I don't know if that will feed into your conference later, but anyway, I thought I'd throw that in.
Suella Braverman, that please.
Sorry?
Tell Suella Braverman that idea of exporting people isn't a good idea.
Yeah. Yes. I wish philosophers had that much influence, but I'm afraid we don't.